Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Welcome this morning to our study in the Word in the writing called Hebrews. Last week we saw that Jesus was a high priest, and we said we were going to delay talking about the model for his high priesthood, that being Melchizedek. So Lee, it's time for us to resurrect Melchizedek here this morning.
Right. In this section, Jesus is being compared and contrasted to Aaron, the first high priest, and
under the law.
Yes. And the point that our author is trying to make is that Jesus is superior not only to prophets and to angels and to Moses and to Joshua. He's also superior to the high priests of Israel.
Aaron.
And
his successors.
Yes, and so Jesus is our great high priest. He's our preeminent high priest, and the argument he's going to make is that he's the only high priest we need. We don't need
and his high priesthood is not lost by death, but it is an eternal high priesthood that has no end.
Right. And in this chapter 7, where our lesson is located today, we see the basis of his argument for establishing that fact, that Jesus is our great high priest who brings eternal salvation.
We need to notice that there is an intervening section, mostly chapter 6, which is sort of an aside. And we're not talking about it. It does not have anything really to do with the subject at hand.
Right.
But Melchizedek was in chapter 5, skipped over in chapter 6, and now at the beginning, right at the end, the last verse of chapter 6, he shows back up, and that's a bridge back to the topic of Melchizedek.
Right. All right, well, let me read here from chapter 7 in Hebrews. Beginning in verse 1, this Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Then also king of Salem means king of peace, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now we're skipping some verses, and among the verses we skip are two very crucial verses that I'd like for you to read to make the connection for us.
This we're in chapter 7, verses 15 and 16. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not according to a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life.
All right, and now we'll pick up with the reference to the legal requirement in verse 18, back in the printed text. The former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless, for the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced, by which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath. Others became priests without an oath, but he became a priest with an oath when God said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant. Now, there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men in all their weakness, but the oath, which came after the law, appointed the Son, who has been made perfect forever.
Well,
this is a very complex argument here. And,
it is.
And one that's a little bit strange to our ears, although I think you would say that it's fairly typical for the way a Jewish rabbi would explain Old Testament scriptures.
Let's talk about Melchizedek. The story about him is, it just pops up out of nowhere in Genesis chapter 14. And Melchizedek is the king of Jerusalem. And he is a priest king of Jerusalem, which is an unusual thing that we don't usually think about, a king being a priest, but that was the order of things back in those days. Now, he's not involved in the story until after the war is completed. Abraham gets involved in a war of 5 kings against 4 kings, and it focuses on the Jordan Rift. I mean, starting all the way at the southern end of the Dead Sea and making its way northward, north of Damascus. And Abraham comes along with his little army and saves Lot.
Yeah, that's really why he got involved. He wasn't too interested in general, but since his nephew Lot has been kidnapped
And hauled away past
as a prisoner,
Damascus, yes.
Abraham feels the need to go up north and rescue him.
And he rescues Lot, but in the process defeated the 4 kings and
takes some plunder.
Right? He just really comes back loaded.
Yeah.
And he then returns the stuff that has been stolen from the 5 kings down in the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea Valley, and returns everything to them. And they say, we're going to pay you for what you've done for us. And he says, I won't take anything. Only what my army has eaten, and we won't pay you for that, but that's all we're going to take. Then in the process, he goes to Jerusalem. And now Melchizedek enters the scene. And Melchizedek has supplied food to Abraham and his army, little army. And that's what it means. It's when the text says Melchizedek blessed Abraham. A blessing always involves a gift of some kind. So Abraham has received this gift. Now in return, he gives a gift, 1/10 of what he has gained.
And this would have been perceived as a gift through Melchizedek the priest to God, would it?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So this is a kind of offering. We call it a tithe.
A tithe, yes.
And so here we see that in that culture, a tithe was a common kind of offering even before it became encoded in the law of Moses.
Now what this really is a thank offering for the victory that Abraham has enjoyed. And of course, Lot and the kings of the south have enjoyed through Abraham. Always, a victory here on earth in those days was looked upon as a victory given by a god. So the blessing of Melchizedek and the support of Melchizedek is then rewarded by the God of the city being the God Most High, as he's described, being given this tithe by Abraham through Melchizedek. Melchizedek then functions as priest. He's king, but he's also priest.
Yeah. Now, the way in which this whole story fits into the argument is brought out very clearly in the verses that we skipped. Back in chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, our author says, one might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham,
Yes.
when he was in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him.
And thereby, since Aaron is a descendant of Levi, Aaron did also. Now this is curious, and I'm sure our viewers are confused. How in the world, what kind of logic is this? Well, it's absolutely perfect logic among Jewish people.
This is the
and
way,
we're dealing here with Jewish people.
right. And so the way they're thinking is that Abraham made an offering to God using the intercessory priesthood of Melchizedek. So that means that Melchizedek is closer to God, as it were, or
Yes.
superior to Abraham.
Yeah, he's the go-between.
Right.
That's what a priest is.
And the way the Jewish mind worked, Levi, who was a descendant of Abraham's,
Not born yet.
not born yet, but in his loins, which is the phrase, was kind of present at the time that Abraham makes this offering.
Yes.
And Aaron, a descendant of Levi's, is also present. So Abraham and all of his descendants, including Aaron, the high priest, were recognizing the superiority of yet another priest, Melchizedek, in his intercessory role with
Yes,
God.
yes. The priest who became the head priest under Mosaic law then was seen as contributing to Melchizedek, this priest
Right.
of the
And
Most High God.
It's that way of thinking that allows the writer of Hebrews here to say the verses that you said, therefore another priest arises. It's logical that another priest must arise, because the Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, the priesthood we read about in the Old Testament, was not the only priesthood, and it was not the ultimate priesthood.
Well, this sounds kooky, to be frank about it, but we need to understand. Let's take, for example, the way in which the Passover is kept by Jewish people to this day. A very important part of the theory, the theology of the Passover, and the reason for keeping it is, put this way, every Jew must see himself as having been present in the salvation that God gave to Moses and the Israelites way back yonder millennia before. Every Jew, you must see yourself as being personally present. And that's the mentality that we have here. That now, there's another thing about Melchizedek, who is said to be without beginning and without end.
Yeah, that's going to be.
How do we get there?
That's going to be another point. Verse 3 is also kind of curious in yet a different way. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without birth or death. Now, obviously,
So was he hatched?
obviously, that doesn't mean that he didn't have a father or mother or genealogy or birth or death. It just means that there's none referred to in Scripture. And
Correct.
it was very common to identify people by who their father was.
Sure.
Or in some cases mother, but usually father.
Or sometimes in that part of the world, you know your ancestry for 20 generations.
Yeah, and so we meet, who is Shealtiel? He's Shealtiel, son of so-and-so, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes,
Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel,
there we
the son
go,
of,
the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so.
all the way back
Yes.
to David.
So, but there's no comment like that made of Melchizedek.
No, we don't hear that he is the son of anybody, and we don't hear that anybody is the descendant of Melchizedek. So he is thereby, and this is again Jewish mentality, Jewish interpretation. He is without beginning and without end because we're not told about anybody before him or anybody after him.
And the narrative about him is so short that we don't know anything about his birth. We don't know anything about his death. Just this one little snapshot when Abraham encountered him.
That's how the text of Hebrews comes out. He is without beginning and without end.
And that gives him, that gives our writer the basis for saying that the Son of God, whom he's comparing to Melchizedek, remains a priest forever.
I think it's really interesting the way this is put, that he resembles the Son of God.
That
seems backwards.
It does, and he's going to turn it around later on in verse 15 of chapter 7.
Which I read.
Which you read, but isn't in our printed text, where it says that
another priest,
the other priest, that's Jesus in his thinking, resembles Melchizedek.
Yeah. So Jesus resembles Melchizedek, and Melchizedek resembles Jesus.
Right.
How in the world do you arrive at that conclusion, you see?
Yeah, that's an unusual way of thinking. We call this typology, where one historical figure kind of foreshadows a later historical figure, and the later historical figure fulfills the foreshadowing of the earlier figure.
Yes.
It goes back and forth. So it is an unusual way of thinking.
It's not the way we think nowadays. But that's okay. I mean, we put ourselves back into the world of the book of Hebrews, and this resonates with Jewish people because that's the way they think, and the rabbis think in that day.
So these intervening verses make the point that not only are there other priests, we actually need another priest, because perfection was not attained by the priests, the Aaronic priests.
Yes.
And the law that they oversaw did not lead to moral perfection.
And the religion.
And the religion.
As it was defined, as advanced as it was in its own time, it was not intended, and this is what the writer of Hebrews is saying, it was not intended to be unending. It was a kind of temporary advancement from which there would be a later advancement with the priesthood of Jesus.
And he makes that point in verse 11 of chapter 7, again, part that we skipped. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, what further need would there have been to speak of another priest arising according to the order of Melchizedek? So he's saying perfection was not attainable in that way, maturity.
But it's interesting. Now, this connection of the character of Melchizedek in connection with the king of Jerusalem under David's, in David's generations and following, is very interesting. It comes out of Psalm 110.
Which is the only other place where Melchizedek is mentioned in the Old Testament. Yeah.
And you are a priest forever, God tells the king who is being inaugurated of the line of David. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Also in that psalm, his military victories are described. In other words, you're going to be king, you're going to be a warrior, as most kings have to be in that era, but you're also going to be priest.
Yeah. Now, it's that verse in Psalm 110, verse 4, it's that verse that includes a word that he's going to jump on and use to make another contrast between Aaron and Jesus, and it's the word swear, or
oath.
Swear an oath.
Take an oath.
Yeah, because that verse in Psalm 110 says, the Lord has sworn an oath and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. And
you being the king who is a descendant of David in the first place, but now taken as applicable to Jesus.
Right. And so that's the argument beginning in verse 20. Our viewers may say, what is all this about with an oath, without an oath? But that's very important to the argument of our writer here, and it's based on Psalm 110, verse 4. The priests of the Jews had no oath associated with it. They were appointed.
They were appointed on the basis of biological descendancy, and that was referred to in what I read also.
Yes, it was.
And they are priests by virtue of who their ancestry was. But this new king, the perfect king, who is Jesus, is because of the power of an indestructible life. Now here, what's being referred to, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension and glorification of Jesus, who still lives, as they taught.
And that's the point that's being made in verse 23 and 24. Very important.
Yes.
Other priests die, but Jesus lives forever. Jesus remains, and therefore has a permanent priesthood, and he's the one who now intercedes with us to God in behalf of ourselves.
Because he is not on earth, visible and approachable as a human being anymore, does not mean that he is dead. As far as this writer is concerned, he is very much alive and is functioning still in the priestly manner and in our behalf.
Yeah, and we noted last week just how often the writer of Hebrews appeals to his exaltation.
Exactly.
Sitting at the right hand of God, exalted to the right hand of God, ascending to the right hand of God.
Well, when we talk about the gospel, the content of the gospel, the birth, the death, resurrection of Christ, sometimes we stop. That's not where the gospel stops.
It's not where the gospel stops, and it's interesting that it's not where the book of Acts starts. The book of Acts starts with the resurrection, but very quickly goes on to narrate the ascension. And it's on the basis of those two great realities that the church then begins and flourishes.
Exactly. And doesn't Peter define the gospel in that very first sermon in chapter 2 of Acts?
He takes it all the way through the exaltation.
Through the ascension and exaltation.
Yes,
he sits at the right hand of majesty on high.
Right. So, Jesus is like Melchizedek in that he has neither beginning nor end. He's like Melchizedek in that he was designated high priest by an oath, a divine oath.
Divine oath, yes.
He's like Melchizedek and unlike Aaron in that he, quote, lives forever and therefore has a permanent high priesthood.
He died once. That's another thing that is being communicated here. Yeah. It is not an annual, like Day of Atonement event that annually we push back the sins of the past year, but rather it is one tremendous, overwhelming sacrifice of himself that is good for time and eternity.
Right, and that's the point of verse 27. Unlike other high priests, he does not need to offer daily sacrifices.
Or annual.
Or annual.
Yes.
He offered for their sins once, and he offered himself. That's verse.
Now that's another
verse
difference.
27.
The priest is in fact the sacrifice.
Right. And that point is going to be made very clearly in Hebrews chapter 10. Now, we're not going to have a lesson on that in this current series.
We end our discussion here of Jesus as high priest without completing what Hebrews says.
Our viewers might want to read on through Hebrews
8, 9, and 10.
8, 9, and 10, and there the climax will be exactly what you're saying, that the priest does not bring the blood of bulls and goats, that is a sacrifice of something else, to bring to God, but that the priest is the sacrifice. The sacrifice is the priest.
That's the climax. That's the point that the whole exercise, starting out in chapter 1, verse 1, is aimed at.
Right in that opening section, he made purification for our sins as the priest and as the sacrifice.
Yes.
And that's the point that verse 27 makes here. He offered himself once.
Now, there's another concept here that we're missing, and we'll not be able to get in. We need to say something about it. There is this promise in Jeremiah 31, beginning at verse 31, about the only place in the Old Testament where this language is ever used, a new covenant.
Yes.
And that becomes the theme that follows where we are right now. But there's no treatment of it in our Sunday school series.
Well, there's a hint of it in verse 22. Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor or guarantee of a better covenant. And I think that's a hint of that.
Yeah, well, there the subject is introduced, and it is developed in chapter 8, which we won't have a lesson from.
Right. Now, there is another contrast here that's brought out in verse 26 I wanted to mention. Such a high priest truly meets our needs, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, and exalted. And there's another way in which Jesus stands apart from Aaron or any other priest.
Yes.
In his person, in his character, in the characteristics and qualities of his existence.
Right, sinless, which was introduced earlier. Yes. I think it's interesting, Melchizedek is never said to be sinless because there's no listing of anything bad he did.
Right.
But anyway...
They didn't presume that.
No, they didn't presume that. Yeah. But anyway, that's the characteristic of Jesus.
You mentioned this word new covenant or better covenant, and it reminds me that we have the word better twice in our passage here. It's one of the favorite words of our writer. The first time it appears is in verse 19, where he says, Jesus is a better hope.
Yes.
We have a better hope in Jesus. And then again in verse 22, what you were referring to, through Jesus we have a better covenant.
Yes.
And the writer of Hebrews just loves this concept. Let me tell you a few.
Yes.
He has a better name than the angels. We have this better hope. We have better promises, better sacrifices, better possessions. We look forward to a better country, we experience a better resurrection, and we share in a better forgiveness.
All because of Jesus.
All because of Jesus, who stands superior to everything that we read about in the Old Testament. And
over again it is said all the way through, don't give up, don't retreat from Jesus. Keep your eye on Jesus.
Keep your eye on Jesus. He's the better option.
Well, we have made our way through a lot of Hebrews. There's one more lesson, and we will move into chapter 12 next time, which comes after chapter 11, obviously. But we'll be talking about chapters 11 and 12 next week to finish up this discussion. We hope you'll come back and be with us.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.